The rain fell heavy on Long Island that November night in 1916, cold, unforgiving, the kind of rain that soaks through expensive coats and cheap ones just the same. But Frank Woolworth wasn't thinking about the rain. He stood in front of the smoking ruins of his wooden mansion, watching the last embers die in the puddles, and his face showed no sadness. None at all, just a strange, cold smile. The fire had taken everything, furniture, paintings, memories. But Frank Woolworth wasn't mourning. He was calculating, because for a man who spent his whole life terrified of being forgotten, this fire was not a tragedy. It was permission to build something so big, so grand, so impossible to ignore that it would scream his name across the centuries long after he was dust. What happened next would become one of the strangest stories in American history. A story about a poor farm boy who built an empire selling cheap goods for 5 cents, then used that fortune to construct a marble palace that would curse 3 generations of his family. This is not a fairy tale about hard work and success. This is a story about what happens when ambition turns into obsession, when love gets confused with control, and when a house built to defeat death becomes a tomb for the living. They called it Winfield Hall, 6 rooms, pink marble staircases that cost $2 million just for the steps. Gold ceilings, Napoleon's bedroom recreated down to the last detail, a pipe organ that could shake the walls and make the floor tremble like an earthquake. $9 million in 1917 money, more than $200 million today, built in less than 1 year, which should have been impossible. But Frank Woolworth didn't believe in impossible. He believed in force, in will, in making the world bend to match the picture in his head. But here's what nobody talks about: the lightning strike that cracked the marble fireplace and split his dead daughter's face in half on the family crest. The servants who whispered about cold spots in empty hallways. The granddaughter who inherited everything and died alone, bankrupt, her massive fortune dissolved into nothing. And the final cosmic joke in 2015, when the fireproof fortress Frank built in terror of flames burst into fire and burned his precious Napoleon bedroom to ash. Some houses are just buildings, 4 walls and a roof, a place to sleep and eat and live, but some houses are different. They're monuments, statements, warnings carved in stone. Winfield Hall was never meant to be a home. It was meant to be proof that a boy from a potato farm could become a king, proof that money could buy immortality, proof that if you build the walls thick enough, death can't find you inside. Frank Woolworth was wrong about all of it. If you believe that money is just money, that houses are just houses, that the past stays buried where we leave it, then this story will feel impossible. But if you've ever felt that some places hold memory in their walls, that some ambitions carry a price that echoes forward through time, then you already know. Winfield Hall isn't just expensive real estate with a tragic history. It's a mirror, and what it reflects back is the shape of the American dream when it curdles into nightmare. The truth is buried in the foundation, in the marble. In the 20-year gap between the day Frank Woolworth stood triumphant in his finished palace and the day they sold it for pennies because nobody wanted to live there, something happened in those walls, something that turned gold into lead and warmth into ice. This is that story. The real one, the one they don't put in architecture magazines. The story begins long before the mansion, long before the money. It begins in dirt, Rodman, New York, 1852, a place so small and forgotten that even saying its name feels like apologizing. Potato fields stretched in every direction, frozen half the year, muddy the other half. The Woolworth farm sat at the edge of this nowhere, and on it lived a stern man named John Woolworth, who believed that land was everything and work was prayer. His son Frank believed the exact opposite. Frank hated the farm, hated the smell of dirt and manure, hated the feeling of mud sucking at his boots, hated the endless gray sameness of it. While other boys learned to plow and plant, Frank stood at the edges of fields and stared at nothing, dreaming of somewhere else. Anywhere else. His father thought he was lazy, called him soft, useless, but Frank wasn't lazy. He was just looking for a different kind of power, the kind you couldn't dig out of the ground. At 21, Frank escaped to work in a country store called Augsbury and Moore. Finally, walls instead of sky, a roof instead of rain, products lined up neat on shelves. But there was a problem. Frank Woolworth was terrible at selling. At that time, selling meant arguing. You sized up the customer, named a high price, then fought them down through negotiation. It was combat, and Frank, skinny and shy with a stutter that got worse under pressure, lost every single fight. His boss William Moore told him straight, "You're too soft for this business, boy. You'll never be able to sell." Those words should have ended everything. For most people, they would have, but Frank heard them differently. He didn't hear "you're not good enough." He heard the system is wrong. If he couldn't make people buy through pressure, he'd have to create a system where goods sold themselves. In 1878, Frank proposed something crazy to his boss. Take all the old, stale merchandise nobody wanted and pile it on one table. Put up a sign, any item on this table, 5 cents, that's it, fixed price, no negotiation, no argument. Just pick it up, pay 5 cents, walk out. Moore thought it was idiotic, but he had nothing to lose on junk merchandise, so he let Frank try. The table sold out in hours, completely empty. People lined up to grab things they didn't even need just because 5 cents felt like nothing. Frank had discovered something profound and dangerous. He'd discovered that poor people who were afraid to walk into fancy stores because they knew they'd be looked down on, people who couldn't afford to negotiate, would spend money instantly if you made them feel safe and in control. He wasn't selling products, he was selling dignity, 5 cents at a time. In June 1879, Frank opened his first owned store in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The first day brought in $127.65. A fortune. Lines formed outside before he even unlocked the door. Within a year, he had 3 stores. Within 5 years, 25. By 1900, Frank Woolworth controlled the largest retail chain in America. Bright, clean stores in every major city, red and gold signs, walls covered in products arranged like art. And everything, every single thing, cost either 5 or 10 cents. Poor factory workers could walk in and buy a hairbrush, a toy for their child, a bar of soap, and walk out feeling rich for a moment. Frank had weaponized cheapness. He'd turned scarcity into abundance at a price nobody could resist. But here's where the darkness creeps in. Frank Woolworth was not a kind man. He paid his workers, mostly young women, almost nothing. He believed that working in his clean, bright stores was its own reward, that they should be grateful for the privilege. He fought unions. He squeezed suppliers until they bled. He copied his competitors' ideas, then drove them out of business by selling cheaper. He played the game exactly the way his father's generation had played farming, brutally, efficiently. Without sentiment, by 1910, Frank Woolworth was one of the richest men in America. He had achieved the impossible. The soft boy from the potato farm now controlled an empire. But here's the thing about empires built on selling to the poor. They don't impress the rich. New York's old money aristocracy, the Vanderbilts and Astors and Rockefellers, they looked at Frank Woolworth and saw a shopkeeper. A clever one, sure, a successful one, but still just a man who sold cheap junk to factory workers. They didn't invite him to their parties, didn't open their social clubs to him, didn't treat him like an equal. And Frank, who had conquered poverty and built an empire, discovered that the one thing money couldn't buy was automatic respect from people who'd been born with it. That realization ate at him, poisoned him. He'd spent his whole life climbing, and when he finally reached the top of the mountain, he found another mountain above it. One he couldn't climb with coins, so Frank decided to build his own mountain. If they wouldn't accept him as an equal, he'd force them to recognize his superiority through sheer overwhelming grandeur. He'd build a house so magnificent, so expensive, so impossible to ignore that everyone would have to bow before it. But first he needed an obsession to guide him, and he found it in a dead French emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte. The outsider, the Corsican with the wrong accent who conquered all of Europe and made kings kneel. Frank Woolworth studied Napoleon the way religious people study scripture. He collected paintings, sculptures, busts. He read every biography. He memorized battle strategies. He saw in Napoleon a mirror of himself, another small man from nowhere who refused to accept the limb the world tried to impose. Except Napoleon had failed in the end, exiled, defeated, forgotten by the empire he built. Frank Woolworth would not make that mistake. He would build something that couldn't be defeated, something that would last forever. The universe gave him his chance on November 10th, 1916. His wooden mansion, the one he'd lived in for years, caught fire and burned completely to the ground. Everything inside turned to ash and smoke. Witnesses said Frank stood in the rain watching it burn, and his face showed something almost like relief. The old shell had burned away. Now he could build something eternal. He called his architect Charles Pierpont Henry Gilbert, the same man who designed mansions for the richest families in New York. Frank gave him an order that sounded impossible. Build me a new house, make it completely fireproof. No wood anywhere, only marble and stone and steel. Copy the greatest palaces of Europe, and finish it in less than 1 year. Gilbert tried to explain that a house of that scale would take 3 or 4 years minimum. Frank responded with numbers. Unlimited budget, hire an army, work day and night, make it happen. And because Frank Woolworth was a man who'd bent the world to his will 1,000 times before, it happened. If you're still here, you're here because you sense that this story goes deeper than rich man builds mansion. That's good, that instinct is right. These stories take months of research, and support keeps them possible. Not through begging, but through the simple fact that depth requires time. Winfield Hall rose from the ashes like something summoned. Hundreds of workers attacked the site in shifts, 24 hours a day. Stone masons carved marble under floodlights while the neighborhood tried to sleep. The noise was constant, hammering, sawing, shouting in Italian and English and Polish. The whole thing felt less like construction and more like conjuring. A mansion appearing overnight through force of will and bottomless money. The locals watched with a mixture of awe and dread. This wasn't normal. This was something else. The design combined Italian Renaissance and French Baroque, the architectural languages of emperors and popes. Gilbert understood exactly what Frank wanted. Not a home, a temple, a throne room, a stage for one. Man play about victory over poverty and time and death. The entrance hall would be dominated by a staircase of pink marble imported from Italy. The music room would house a massive pipe organ. The master bedroom would recreate Napoleon's personal chambers at the Campigny Palace, Every single room would scream money and power and permanence. But Gilbert, being a brilliant architect and a student of human nature, built something else into the design. He built oppression. The ceilings were too high, the hallways too long, the echoes too loud, the marble too cold. Everything designed to make visitors feel small, to make them understand, on an instinctual level, that they were in the presence of someone greater. This was psychological warfare disguised as interior decoration. Frank approved every detail personally. He obsessed over measurements and materials. He demanded that certain rooms match the exact dimensions of royal palaces in France. He had furniture custom made to replicate pieces owned by Napoleon. This wasn't about comfort. It was about becoming someone else, about erasing the farm boy and replacing him with an emperor. The whole project cost $9 million. In today's money, that's over $200 million, just for a house, just for one man's ego carved in marble. But here's the thing nobody talks about. While Frank was building his monument to himself, his family was falling apart. His wife, Jenny, was sick, early dementia, depression. She wandered the halls confused, forgetting where she was. His daughters looked at the rising walls and felt no excitement, only dread. They understood something Frank didn't. A house this grand isn't built for living. It's built for display, and they would be the exhibits. By early 1917, Winfield Hall was finished. 56 rooms spread across multiple floors. A grand staircase that cost $2 million just for the stone and the carving. Gold leaf measured in kilograms covering the ceilings, bathrooms with solid gold and silver faucets, a dining room that could seat 50 people, a music room with a pipe organ so powerful it could make the walls vibrate. And at the center of it all, Frank's personal bedroom, the Empire Room, an exact copy of Napoleon's private chamber, down to the canopy on the bed and the imperial monograms on the furniture. Frank slept there every night, surrounded by symbols of an emperor he'd never met, in a palace built to prove he was somebody. But he was alone. His wife was a ghost. His daughters were distant. His grandchildren were strangers. The house was perfect and empty. Crossing the threshold of Winfield Hall was like entering a different dimension. Not warmer, colder, the main hall opened up into a vast space dominated by that legendary pink marble staircase. Each step, each railing, each carved detail represented thousands of dollars. $2 million total just for this one architectural feature. The pink marble had been chosen specifically because it was rare and expensive and beautiful in a strange, almost fleshy way. It made the house feel alive, but not in a comforting way. More like you'd been swallowed by something massive and were standing in its throat. The floors were marble. The walls were stone or plaster painted to look like stone. The ceilings towered overhead, covered in gold leaf and carved details. There was virtually no wood anywhere in the house. Frank's terror of fire had created a space that felt more like a crypt than a home. Cold, echoing, hard, every footstep clicked and bounced off the surfaces. Every whisper became a shout. Privacy was impossible. You were always aware of the house around you, pressing in, watching. The music room held the pipe organ, a massive instrument built by the Aeolian Company. Frank couldn't play it professionally, but he didn't need to. The system was automated. He could program it to play complex pieces while he sat in the darkness, watching lights change color in time with the music. Servants described eerie scenes. The old man alone in the vast room, lights flashing red and gold and blue, the organ shaking the floor with sound, and Frank sitting motionless in the center of it all like a conductor of the universe. He called his favorite pieces thunder and lightning. He was obsessed with controlling the elements, with being larger than nature. The organ let him pretend he was. The dining room could seat dozens, but it rarely did. Frank had built a palace for entertaining, but he had no real friends. The walls were covered in carvings meant to imitate the work of Grinling Gibbons, but made of plaster and stone because wood was forbidden. The contrast was strange: fake warmth, fake history, real coldness underneath. The bathrooms were perhaps the most absurd rooms. Solid gold faucets, silver fixtures, marble everywhere. You could take a bath in a bathroom that cost more than most people's houses. But it didn't make you feel rich. It made you feel judged, like the luxury itself was sneering at you for needing to use it. And then there was the Empire Room, Frank's personal bedroom, the holy of holies. This room was an obsession made physical. Every piece of furniture was a replica of something Napoleon had owned. The bed had a canopy with imperial monograms. The walls held portraits of the French emperor, some of them subtly altered so that Napoleon's face looked a bit like Frank's. The whole room was a shrine to a dead emperor and to the ego of a living man who wanted to believe he was just as great. Frank woke up every morning surrounded by symbols of conquest and power, and every morning he was still just Frank Woolworth. The shopkeeper, the 5-cent man, the boy from the potato farm wearing a dead emperor's costume. 70 servants worked in Winfield Hall at its peak. 70 people to maintain a house for one family. They moved through the marble hallways like ghosts, silent and efficient, polishing surfaces that nobody touched, dusting rooms that nobody entered. The house demanded constant attention. Without it, the coldness would have been unbearable. With it, the coldness was merely obvious. The servants whispered among themselves about strange drafts in sealed hallways, about doors that seemed to open on their own, about the feeling of being watched in empty rooms. They didn't use the word haunted out loud, but they thought it. You could see it in how quickly they moved through certain corridors, how they avoided being alone in the music room after dark. The sensory experience of living in Winfield Hall was suffocation dressed up as luxury. The smell was cold stone dust, mixed with flowers changed daily in a desperate attempt to add life to dead space. The sound was echoes, always echoes, your voice bouncing back at you from marble walls. The temperature was wrong. Too cold in winter despite the heating system, too cold in summer despite the windows. The light was strange, filtered through expensive stained glass, bouncing off gold leaf and polished stone. Everything glittered, but nothing glowed. Mirrors were positioned to create infinite hallways of reflections. Walk through Winfield Hall and you'd see yourself repeated endlessly, trapped in glass, unable to escape. The psychological effect was intentional. Gilbert had designed a house that looked down on its inhabitants. That made them feel simultaneously important and insignificant. You lived in a palace, but the palace owned you. Frank Woolworth had built his monument, his proof of success, his fortress against death and poverty and obscurity. He had everything he'd ever wanted, and he was utterly, completely, devastatingly alone. Before moving on, ask yourself this. If you could build any house in the world, unlimited budget, would you build something that made you happy or something that made others respect you? Frank chose respect and paid for it with happiness, but the house was hungry, and it demanded a price far steeper than money. The tumor growing inside Frank Woolworth's family couldn't be seen on architectural blueprints. It lived in the space between father and daughter, in the gap between love and control. Edna Woolworth Hutton was Frank's favorite child, beautiful, sensitive, artistic, the one he'd dreamed would carry his legacy forward. He'd given her everything wealth could buy: private tutors, European tours, a debut that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. But what he'd really given her was a cage, a golden cage with bars made of expectations and social position and the crushing weight of being Frank Woolworth's daughter. In 1907, Edna married Franklin Laws Hutton, an investment banker from a good family. On paper, it was perfect. The union of retail fortune and old money, Frank approved completely. He saw Hutton as the kind of man his daughter deserved. Someone from the world Frank was trying to break into, someone respectable. What Frank didn't see, or chose not to see, was that Hutton was cruel. A philanderer, a man who treated his wife like a trophy he'd won and then forgotten about. The marriage was hell disguised as success. Edna suffered in silence the way women of her class were expected to. She smiled at parties. She hosted dinners. She produced a daughter, Barbara, in 1912, and inside she was dying. Frank was building Winfield Hall while his daughter was collapsing. He was obsessed with marble and measurements, and making sure his bedroom looked exactly like Napoleon's. He didn't notice that Edna had stopped eating, that she moved through rooms like a ghost, that when she looked at him, her eyes were asking for help he couldn't understand how to give. Frank Woolworth knew how to build empires. He knew how to destroy competitors. He knew how to turn 5 cents into millions. But he had no idea how to save his own daughter from the life he'd built for her. May 2nd, 1917. Winfield Hall was nearly complete. The finishing touches were being applied. Frank was probably inspecting some detail of crown molding or arguing about the angle of a chandelier when he got the news. Edna had been found dead in a room at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. She was 33 years old. The official story was mastoiditis, an ear infection that had progressed to suffocation. Plausible. Medical, clean, but everyone in New York's social circles knew the truth. Edna had taken poison. She'd killed herself, unable to bear her husband's affairs and the emptiness of her glittering life any longer. She'd chosen oblivion. Frank Woolworth stood in his nearly finished palace and learned that his favorite daughter was dead. The house he'd built to prove his success, to show the world that the farm boy had become a king, suddenly meant nothing. All that marble couldn't bring her back. All that gold couldn't fill the hole her death tore in him. He'd spent years obsessing over architecture while his daughter drowned in loneliness, and now she was gone. Forever, no amount of money could change it. This is where the story crosses from tragedy into legend. At the center of Winfield Hall's main hall, above the massive fireplace, there was a carved marble bas-relief, a family crest showing the profiles of Frank's 3 daughters, Edna's face carved in stone, preserved forever. Shortly after her funeral, during a spring storm, lightning struck the house. The bolt hit the marble chimney with such force that the stone cracked. But the crack didn't run randomly through the marble. It split precisely through Edna's carved face, cleaving it in two while leaving her sisters' faces untouched. A surgical strike from the sky that destroyed only the dead daughter's image. The servants saw it as a sign, proof that the house was cursed, that Frank had angered something by building his monument to ego, that Edna's death had stained the foundation, and the lightning was just the first visible symptom. Frank saw it differently. He saw guilt carved in stone, a permanent reminder that he'd failed where it mattered most. He'd built a fortress that couldn't burn, but his daughter had burned from the inside. The crack in the marble became the crack in his mind. He had it repaired multiple times, but it always came back. The stone wouldn't heal, neither would he. After Edna's death, Frank changed. The joy he'd taken in his palace evaporated. He still lived there, still walked through the marble halls and slept in Napoleon's bed. But now the house felt like what it had always been, a mausoleum, a tomb for a man still breathing. He became more withdrawn, more obsessed with details and control. As if by managing every tiny aspect of his business and his house, he could prevent anything else from slipping away. But of course, you can't control death. You can only delay it, and delay always ends. If this made you pause, that pause matters. Because this is the moment where success reveals its real cost, not in dollars, in people. The crisis that finally destroyed Frank Woolworth came in April 1919. Not from business failure, not from scandal, from something small and stupid and completely preventable. Frank was terrified of dentists, absolutely phobic. He'd rather suffer with tooth pain than sit in a dentist's chair and let someone work on him. A routine dental infection, the kind that modern antibiotics cure in a week, developed into sepsis. The poison spread through his bloodstream. His body, which had survived 66 years of stress and grief and relentless ambition, began to shut down. He died in his beloved Empire Room, in the bed that copied Napoleon's, surrounded by walls of gold and marble. Servants stood outside the door listening to him struggle for breath. Doctors tried everything they knew, but nothing worked. The infection was too advanced. On April 8, 1919, 5 days before his 67th birthday, Frank Woolworth died in agony. The man who'd built a fireproof fortress died from a tooth infection. The man who'd conquered retail through innovation died because he was too stubborn and scared to see a dentist. The irony was cosmic. He'd spent millions building a house that would last forever. He died from a problem that cost $50 to fix. His funeral was massive. Thousands of people lined the streets. Employees from every Woolworth store across the country sent flowers. But Frank wasn't buried at Winfield Hall. He was laid to rest in a cemetery, under a monument he'd designed himself years before. Because ultimately, Winfield Hall wasn't about family or legacy. It was about ego, and ego dies with the person who built it. Frank's wife Jenny outlived him by only a short time. Her dementia had progressed too far. She wandered through the vast empty house, forgetting who she was. When she died, the house passed to Frank's remaining daughters and, most significantly, to his granddaughter Barbara. Barbara Hutton, 7 years old, the girl who'd found her mother Edna's body at the Plaza Hotel. The girl who'd inherited approximately $28 million, a fortune equivalent to nearly $500 million today. The poor little rich girl, as the press would call her. The nickname was prophetic. It summarized her entire life in 4 words. Barbara Hutton grew up in Winfield Hall's shadow. She was raised by nannies and servants in that cold marble palace, while her father lived his own life, and her grandfather's ghost stalked the hallways. The psychological damage was immense. She learned early that money couldn't buy love or safety or peace. That luxury was just another form of loneliness, that being rich meant being watched and judged and envied and ultimately always alone. The marble halls echoed with her footsteps. 70 servants attended to her physical needs, but nobody held her when she cried. Nobody made her feel safe. She lived in the most expensive house in America and felt like an orphan. As she grew older, Barbara tried to fill the emptiness the same way her grandfather had, with purchases. But Frank had bought houses and empires. Barbara bought people. She married 7 times, each husband more expensive than the last. Counts and princes and movie stars. She threw legendary parties where champagne flowed and orchestras played, and thousands of people danced. But when everyone went home, she was still alone, still that 7-year-old girl in the marble halls, still looking for something money couldn't buy. She developed anorexia, struggled with pills and alcohol. Her fortune, the money Frank had accumulated 5 cents at a time, began to dissolve, not through business failure, but through desperate attempts to purchase connection. to buy love in a world that only wanted her money. By the 1930s, maintaining Winfield Hall had become impossible. The Great Depression hit. Property taxes skyrocketed. Heating costs alone were astronomical. The 70 servants needed salaries. The marble needed maintenance. The grounds needed groundskeepers. The house that cost $9 million to build was draining money faster than the Woolworth fortune could sustain. In 1937, less than 20 years after Frank's death, the family put Winfield Hall up for sale. $9 million to build. What did they ask? A fraction. What did they get? Nothing. Nobody wanted it. A mansion that huge was a burden, not an asset. Who had the money to maintain it? Who wanted to live in someone else's monument to ego? Who would choose a cold marble palace over a real home? The house sat empty for years, a ghost mansion full of ghost rooms. Vandals broke in. The elements leaked through. The gold leaf tarnished, the marble cracked. Frank Woolworth's fortress against death was dying faster than a wooden house would have. Finally, in the 1940s, Winfield Hall was sold and converted. Into what? A school. The Grace Downs Academy. A finishing school for girls. The halls where Frank had planned to receive kings now held desks and blackboards. The music room where he'd played thunder and lightning on his massive organ became a classroom. Napoleon's bedroom, the Empire Room, Frank's personal shrine to ego and conquest, became just another dormitory. The transformation was humiliating for the architecture, but salvation for the building. It gave Winfield Hall a purpose beyond one man's vanity. It saved it from demolition, but even transformation couldn't erase the past. Students and teachers reported strange experiences. Cold spots in empty hallways, doors opening by themselves, the sound of footsteps in locked rooms, whispers from nowhere. Shadows moving through walls. The girls joked about it during the day, laughed about the ghost of the old man who couldn't let go of his house. But at night, walking alone through those marble corridors, nobody joked. The house remembered, and what it remembered was loneliness and ambition, and the price of building monuments to yourself. Barbara Hutton never lived at Winfield Hall after childhood. She couldn't bear it. The house represented everything that had destroyed her mother and trapped her grandfather. She spent her life running from it, living in hotels, moving from country to country, marrying and divorcing, spending and spending and spending, trying to escape the cold marble in her memory. In 1979, Barbara Hutton died. Alone, broke, her $billion fortune completely gone, dissolved into jewelry and alimony and desperate attempts to buy what money can't purchase. The cycle Frank had started ended with his granddaughter's death in a modest apartment. No marble, no gold. Just emptiness. The universe wasn't finished with Winfield Hall. In January 2015, almost a century after Frank Woolworth built his fireproof fortress, the impossible happened. Winfield Hall caught fire. The blaze started mysteriously and spread through the structure. It destroyed Frank's beloved master bedroom. The Empire Room, Napoleon's replicated chamber, the heart of the house, the room where Frank had died. All of it burned. The irony was so perfect it felt intentional. The man who'd built his entire palace from stone and marble in terror of fire, the man who declared it absolutely fireproof, had his most precious room consumed by flames 96 years after he thought he'd defeated them. The house he'd built to last forever was wounded in its soul. Today, Winfield Hall stands as a ruin. Parts of it still function as a school, parts of it are empty, parts of it are charred remains. The grand staircase still exists. The marble is still there, but the meaning is gone. It's no longer a monument to Frank Woolworth's triumph. It's a monument to the emptiness of building monuments, A reminder that stone and gold and marble can't purchase love or happiness or peace. That a house is only as alive as the warmth inside it, and there was never any warmth in Winfield Hall. Only cold ambition dressed in expensive materials. The story of Winfield Hall asks a question that every generation has to answer. What are you building, and for who? Frank Woolworth built for himself, for his ego, for the ghosts of his childhood that told him he wasn't good enough. He succeeded beyond imagination at creating wealth and constructing a palace, but he failed at the only thing that matters. He failed to build a home. He failed to give his family love that felt like safety instead of love that felt like control. He built a fortress to protect him from the world's judgment, and in doing so, he locked himself away from everything worth protecting. His daughter died alone in a hotel room. His granddaughter died broke and broken. His palace became a school. His fireproof bedroom burned. Every single thing he tried to make permanent dissolved or transformed or betrayed him. Not because the universe was cruel, but because he'd misunderstood the assignment. Life isn't about building things that last forever. It's about building connections that make the temporary time we have feel like enough. Frank spent his whole life trying to prove he was somebody, and he was Frank Woolworth, the 5-cent king, the boy who escaped the potato farm and built an empire. But he could have been more. He could have been a father his daughter trusted, a grandfather his granddaughter remembered with warmth, a husband his wife felt safe with. He chose marble over people, and marble, for all its beauty and cost, doesn't love you back. If you're still here at the end of this, you're the kind of person who understands that some stories matter more than entertainment. That depth beats spectacle, that the tragedies of the past teach us how to live now. That's rare and valuable. Walk past Winfield Hall today and you'll see a building, beautiful in places, ruined in others, but look closer. Look at those dark windows. Look at the cracks in the marble. Listen to the silence. You're not looking at a house. You're looking at a warning carved in stone, a warning that says ambition without love is just another form of suicide. That money without connection is just expensive loneliness. That you can build the grandest palace in the world and still die alone and afraid because palaces don't keep you warm at night. People do, love does, and Frank Woolworth forgot that, or maybe he never learned it. Either way, the lesson is carved into every inch of Winfield Hall's marble halls. Build what you love, not what will impress people you don't even like. Build for warmth, not for grandeur. Build homes, not monuments, because monuments are for the dead, and you're still alive. The gates of Winfield Hall are closed now. The marble staircase stands in darkness. The gold ceilings tarnish. The lightning-split fireplace holds its crack like a scar. And somewhere in those cold halls, if you believe in such things, maybe Frank Woolworth still walks. Still checking the details, still making sure every piece of marble is perfect, still trying to prove something to ghosts who stopped caring 100 years ago. Still alone in the palace he built to defeat loneliness, still searching for the one thing money couldn't buy and architecture couldn't contain. Still looking for home in a house that never was won. That's the curse of Winfield Hall. Not ghosts or bad luck or supernatural punishment. The curse is simpler and more terrible. The curse is that Frank Woolworth got exactly what he wanted. He built his monument. He proved his worth to the world. He created something that would outlast him. And none of it mattered. None of it filled the hole. None of it made him happy. He won everything except the life he actually needed to live. The servants who worked at Winfield Hall during Frank's final years told stories that never made it into official histories. Stories about the old man wandering the marble halls at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, touching the walls as if checking that they were still solid. Stories about him sitting alone in the dining room built for 50 people, eating in silence while 70 servants moved like shadows around him. Stories about the organ concerts he'd conduct for himself in the music room, the thunder and lightning compositions shaking the house while he sat motionless in the darkness, tears running down his face. These weren't the actions of a triumphant emperor. These were the actions of a prisoner trapped in a cage he'd spent $9 million to build. One servant, a housekeeper named Margaret, who worked at Winfield Hall from 1917 until Frank's death, kept a diary. Years later, her granddaughter found it and shared pieces with historians. Margaret wrote about the day after Edna's funeral. Frank stood in front of the cracked marble fireplace for 3 hours straight. Didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the split in his daughter's carved face. When Margaret finally approached him to ask if he needed anything, he turned to her and said something she never forgot. He said, "I built this house to prove I was somebody, but the only people who ever made me somebody are gone. What's the point of marble if there's nobody to walk on it with you?" Margaret wrote that she didn't know how to respond. What do you say to a man who'd conquered the world and lost his family in the process? She touched his shoulder. That was all, and Frank began to cry. This titan of industry, this Napoleon of retail, this man who'd built an empire from 5-cent coins, stood in his $9 million palace and wept like a child. The house heard him, the marble absorbed those tears, and from that day forward, Margaret wrote, the house felt different, heavier, like it was holding grief in its walls the way a sponge holds water. The psychological weight of living in Winfield Hall broke everyone who tried. Frank's remaining daughters visited rarely and left quickly. They'd walk through the grand entrance, admire the staircase out of politeness, sit for a tense dinner in the enormous dining room, and then make excuses to leave. The house made them uncomfortable in a way they couldn't explain. It wasn't ugly. It was beautiful, but it was the wrong kind of beautiful, the kind that makes you feel small and judged and inadequate, the kind that whispers you don't belong here even though you're family. Frank didn't understand why his daughters avoided him. He'd built this palace partly for them, to give them a life of luxury and respect, to make them queens in a kingdom of marble. But they didn't want to be queens. They wanted to be daughters. And there's no room in a monument for something as simple as being a daughter. Barbara Hutton's childhood memories of Winfield Hall were nightmares dressed in gold leaf. She described them in interviews later in life, after the money was gone and the marriages had failed and there was nothing left to lose by telling the truth. She said the house was always cold, not just temperature cold, though it was that too, soul cold, the kind of cold that settles in your bones and never leaves. She said she'd run through the marble halls, and her footsteps would echo so loudly it sounded like she was being chased by ghosts. She said the servants were kind but distant, trained to maintain boundaries, to never show too much emotion or attachment. She said she'd wake up in the middle of the night in one of the 56 rooms and forget where she was. The ceiling would be too high, the walls too far away. She'd call for her mother, forgetting for a moment that her mother was dead, and her voice would bounce off the marble and come back to her distorted and strange. Barbara said the worst part wasn't the size or the coldness. The worst part was the feeling that the house was waiting for something, that it had been built with a purpose it hadn't fulfilled yet, that it was hungry. She was 7 years old when she inherited that massive fortune. 7 years old, trying to make sense of servants and lawyers and trust funds and newspapers calling her the richest girl in the world. And through it all, Winfield Hall loomed in the background of her life like a marble ghost. Every major decision she made, every marriage she entered, every fortune she spent, was shaped by the lesson she'd learned in those cold halls. That money doesn't save you, that luxury doesn't love you back, that you can have everything and still have nothing. Her first marriage was at 21 to Prince Alexis Mdivani, a Georgian fortune hunter who married her for her money and didn't bother hiding it. The wedding was lavish, newspapers covered every detail. Barbara wore a dress that cost thousands. The reception was at the Ritz. Champagne flowed, and Barbara, standing in the middle of all that celebration, felt exactly the way she'd felt in Winfield Hall. Alone, surrounded by people who wanted something from her but didn't actually know her, the marriage lasted less than 2 years. Mdivani took millions in the divorce. Barbara didn't care. She'd learned in her grandfather's marble palace that you can't buy love, but you can buy company. And company, even fake company, was better. Marriage followed the same pattern. Count Kurt von Hogwitz-Reventlow, Cary Grant, Prince Igor Trubetskoy, Porfirio Rubirosa, Baron Gottfried von Kram, Prince Pierre Don Vin na Champasak, lawyer Larry Lichtenstein. 7 husbands, each one expensive in different ways. Some took her money directly. Some took it through alimony. Some took it through gifts and allowances and lifestyles she funded. But what they all took, what they all consumed, was her hope. Each marriage began with Barbara believing maybe this time would be different. Maybe this man would love her for herself. Maybe she could finally escape the coldness of Winfield Hall and build something warm, and each marriage ended with the lesson reinforced. The coldness follows you. The marble is in your bones now. You can't buy your way out of what you learned in childhood. The money disappeared the way Frank's life had disappeared, slowly and then all at once. Barbara spent millions on jewelry, millions on houses she never lived in, millions on parties for people who forgot her name the next day, millions on husbands and lawyers and hangers-on, and anyone who promised they could fill the emptiness. Her weight dropped to dangerous levels. Anorexia consumed her body the way loneliness consumed her mind. She took pills to sleep, pills to wake up, pills to feel something, pills to feel nothing. The poor little rich girl became the tragic tabloid queen. Photographers followed her everywhere. Newspapers chronicled her decline with barely concealed glee. The public that had once envied her now pitied her, and pity, Barbara discovered, was even lonelier than envy. By the 1970s, Barbara Hutton's fortune was essentially gone. $28 million, the equivalent of nearly $500 million in today's money, dissolved into nothing. She lived in small apartments in Los Angeles. She couldn't pay her bills. She relied on the charity of former friends and employees. The woman who'd inherited one of the greatest fortunes in American history died with less than $4,000 to her name. On May 11, 1979, Barbara Hutton died of a heart attack. She was 66 years old, the same age her grandfather Frank had been when he started building Winfield Hall, the same age that marks the beginning and end of the cycle. She was buried next to her mother Edna, the daughter who'd killed herself to escape, the granddaughter who'd spent her whole life trying to do the same thing, just more slowly. The newspapers that reported Barbara's death noted the irony. The richest girl in the world died poor. But they missed the deeper truth. Barbara had always been poor. She'd been poor in the ways that actually matter. Poor in love, poor in safety, poor in peace. The money was always just decoration, just another layer of marble over emptiness. She'd inherited her grandfather's fortune and his curse, the curse of believing that accumulation could substitute for connection, that you could build walls high enough to keep out loneliness, that if you just bought enough, spent enough, impressed enough people, Eventually, you'd feel full. Frank Woolworth learned that lesson too late. Barbara learned it early and couldn't unlearn it. Both died rich in things and bankrupt in what mattered. Here's what nobody talks about when they tell the story of Winfield Hall: the builders, the hundreds of workers who carved the marble and laid the stone and painted the gold leaf. They worked 24-hour shifts for more than a year to construct Frank's palace. Many of them were immigrants. Italian stonemasons, Irish laborers, Polish carpenters. They earned a few dollars a day. They lived in boarding houses in Glen Cove. They sent money home to families in Europe. They built beauty they'd never afford to live in. And when Winfield Hall was finished, when the last piece of gold leaf was applied and the last marble slab was set, they moved on to the next job. They didn't get to walk through the finished halls and admire their work. They weren't invited to the parties. Their names don't appear in any history books, but their hands shaped every inch of that palace. Their sweat is mixed into the mortar. Their exhaustion is carved into the details. One of those workers was a man named Giuseppe Mariani, a master stonemason from Tuscany. He carved the pink marble staircase, every step, every railing, every decorative flourish. $2 million worth of stone shaped by his hands. It took him and his team 8 months of constant work. Giuseppe kept a journal written in Italian that his great-grandson translated years later. In it, Giuseppe described the surreal experience of building something so extravagant while living in a rented room with 4 other men. He wrote about Frank Woolworth visiting the construction site and demanding changes, oblivious to how many hours of work each change required. He wrote about the pressure, the impossible deadline, the threat of being fired if they didn't meet it. And he wrote something profound. He said, "We are building a prison disguised as a palace. We are building a tomb for a living man. He doesn't know it yet, but the stone knows." Giuseppe finished the staircase and moved on. He worked on other mansions, other projects. He never got rich, never built anything for himself even close to the grandeur of Winfield Hall. But he went home every night to his family, his wife, his children, his small, warm house that smelled like cooking and sounded like laughter. And Giuseppe, who'd shaped millions of dollars worth of marble for a man he'd never have a conversation with, understood something Frank Woolworth never did: that the value of a house isn't in its materials, it's in what happens inside it. That a small warm place filled with people who love you is worth infinitely more than a vast cold palace filled with possessions. Giuseppe died in 1945. He's buried in a modest cemetery in Brooklyn. No marble, no gold, just a simple stone with his name and dates. But he died surrounded by family, and that made him richer than Frank Woolworth ever was. The transformation of Winfield Hall into Grace Downs Academy in the 1940s was supposed to erase the past. Turn the page, give the house a new purpose, and in practical terms it worked. The school operated there for decades. Thousands of young women walked those marble halls, learned deportment and etiquette and social graces. The house that Frank had built to impress high society became a factory for creating young women who'd fit into high society. The irony was thick. Frank, who'd been rejected by the elite despite his wealth, had his house turned into a training ground for the next generation of the elite. The palace that couldn't buy him respect became a place where others learned the performance of respectability. But the students reported strange experiences that suggested the house remembered its origins. A girl named Patricia, who attended in the 1950s, wrote about it in a memoir published years later. She described walking through the second-floor hallways late at night and hearing organ music, faint but unmistakable. The thunder and lightning compositions Frank had loved, but the organ had been disconnected decades before. The pipes were sealed. There was no way for it to produce sound. Patricia and her roommate followed the music to the old music room, now converted into a lecture hall. The music stopped the moment they opened the door. The room was empty, silent, but the air felt heavy, like something had just left. Another student, Margaret, described waking up in the middle of the night in her dormitory room, formerly one of the guest bedrooms, and seeing a figure standing at the window. An old man in outdated clothing, just standing there looking out at the grounds. Margaret was terrified but couldn't move or scream. She just watched as the figure stood motionless for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then he faded, not walked away, faded, like smoke dissipating. In the morning, Margaret told her friends. They laughed, said she'd been dreaming, but Margaret insisted. She knew what she'd seen, and besides, she said, other girls had seen him too. Always the same figure, always at windows, always staring out as if looking for something that never came. The teachers didn't like to talk about it, but privately many of them acknowledged the house felt wrong. Too cold even with the heating running, too empty even when full of students, too sad despite the laughter and activity of hundreds of young women. One teacher, Ms. Eleanor Pritchard, who worked there from 1948 to 1975, said in an interview near the end of her life that Winfield Hall was the most beautiful and most depressing place she'd ever worked. She said you could feel the original purpose of the house fighting with its new purpose, like a church converted into a nightclub. The bones remember what they were built for, and no amount of blackboards and desks could make Winfield Hall forget it had been built as a shrine to one man's ego. When the January 2015 fire broke out, it felt less like an accident and more like inevitability. The fireproof fortress catching fire 96 years after it was built to prevent exactly that. The fire started mysteriously, no clear cause ever determined. It spread through the upper floors with shocking speed for a building made almost entirely of stone. It destroyed the Empire Room completely, Frank's sacred space, Napoleon's replica chamber, the bed, the furniture, the imperial monograms, all of it consumed by flames that shouldn't have been able to gain purchase in a marble house. Firefighters who responded to the scene said it was one of the strangest fires they'd ever fought. The way it burned didn't make sense. The intensity in some rooms, the complete absence in others, like the fire was selecting what to destroy. The Empire Room burned so completely that nothing remained but charred stone and ash. Every piece of furniture Frank had commissioned, every detail he'd obsessed over, every symbol of his identification with Napoleon, gone. The bedroom where he'd died in 1919, where he'd spent his final moments suffocating from sepsis while surrounded by imperial grandeur. That room, the heart of his monument, was obliterated. The rest of the house survived with varying degrees of damage, but the Empire Room was targeted, or at least that's how it felt to everyone who saw the aftermath. The fire had found the one room that mattered most and consumed it entirely. Local residents who'd grown up hearing stories about Winfield Hall's curse said the fire was the final chapter. The house had been trying to burn since Frank built it. His first house had burned. He'd built the second to be fireproof out of trauma and fear. But you can't escape what you're meant to face. The fire always comes. It just took 96 years to find its way in. After the fire, Winfield Hall was partially restored and partially abandoned. Some sections still function. Some are empty ruins. The grand staircase survived. Giuseppe's pink marble masterpiece still stands. But it leads to rooms that don't exist anymore, to hallways that end in charred stone, to a second floor that's half memory, half ghost. If you understand why this matters, why a house burning almost a century after it was built carries meaning, then you're seeing what most people miss. That our ambitions outlive us, that the things we build with fear don't protect us, that Frank Woolworth's terror of fire became a prophecy that fulfilled itself when he was long dead. The fire didn't destroy Winfield Hall to punish Frank. Frank was beyond punishment. The fire destroyed the Empire Room to complete the lesson. To show that marble burns, that stone breaks, that nothing we build with our hands is permanent, that the only things that last are the ones we build with love. Winfield Hall stands today, damaged and divided, part school, part ruin, part museum to someone else's dreams. Visitors occasionally tour the remaining sections. They walk Giuseppe's pink marble staircase. They stand in rooms where Frank once stood. They take photographs of the gold leaf and carved details, but they're not seeing Winfield Hall, not really. They're seeing a beautiful corpse. The soul of the house died with Frank. The purpose died with Edna. The meaning died with Barbara. What remains is just expensive stone holding the shape of a dream that failed. The lesson of Winfield Hall isn't about architecture or wealth or even family tragedy, though it's all those things. The lesson is about what we choose to build with our limited time. Frank Woolworth had the resources to build almost anything. He chose a monument to himself, a fortress against death and obscurity and the judgment of people who'd rejected him. He poured his fortune into marble and gold and imperial symbolism, and in the end, none of it mattered. The marble cracked, the gold tarnished, the fortress became a prison. What if he'd built something else? What if he'd spent those resources on his family's actual happiness, on therapy for his wife's dementia, on protecting his daughter from an abusive marriage, on creating a small, warm, safe place instead of a vast, cold, impressive one? What if Frank Woolworth had been humble enough to build a home instead of arrogant enough to build a palace? Would Edna still be alive? Would Barbara have died surrounded by love instead of alone in an apartment she couldn't afford? Would Frank have died in peace instead of agony? We'll never know, because Frank made his choice, and Winfield Hall is the monument to that choice. A monument that teaches us through its failure, that teaches us that what matters isn't how impressive your house looks from the street. What matters is how it feels when you're inside it with the people you love, that 1,000 marble rooms are worth less than one small space where you feel safe and known and cherished, that you can build the grandest palace in history and still die alone, still be forgotten, still be reduced to a cautionary tale told 100 years later to people who have never heard your name. If you've stayed until this final moment, you've chosen depth over distraction, meaning over spectacle. That choice matters. These stories exist to remind us that the mistakes of the past don't have to be our mistakes, that we can learn from other people's tragedies, that Frank Woolworth's life and death and cursed marble palace can teach us how to live better, how to build better, how to love better. Stand at the gates of Winfield Hall today. Look at the cracked marble and tarnished gold. Listen to the silence and ask yourself what you're building with your life, not just literally, metaphorically. What are you accumulating? What are you prioritizing? What are you sacrificing in the pursuit of success or respect or security? Are you building a monument that will impress strangers, or a home that will shelter the people you love? Are you choosing marble or warmth, grandeur or intimacy, the approval of people you don't know or the love of people you do? Frank Woolworth built Winfield Hall, 56 rooms, $9 million, pink marble staircases, gold leaf ceilings, Napoleon's bedroom, thunder and lightning organ concerts, and he died alone, surrounded by luxury. Suffocated by sepsis from a tooth infection, his favorite daughter dead by suicide, his granddaughter destined for bankruptcy and heartbreak. His fortune dissolved, his house transformed, his bedroom burned. Everything he built either crumbled or changed into something he never intended. The fortress failed, the monument became a warning. You have the same choice Frank had, we all do. Build big or build warm. Build impressive or build loving. Build for the judgment of strangers or the comfort of family. Choose marble or choose people. The choice seems obvious stated so plainly, but Frank Woolworth wasn't stupid. He was brilliant. He built an empire. Changed retail forever. His stores put products within reach of millions of poor people. He was a genius at understanding human desire and economic systems. But he failed at the simplest thing. He failed at being present for his family. He failed at choosing love over ambition. He failed at understanding that a warm small house full of laughter beats a cold grand palace full of echoes every single time. That's the curse of Winfield Hall, the real curse, not supernatural, not mystical. Just the simple, terrible curse of getting exactly what you think you want and discovering it's not what you needed at all. Frank Woolworth got his marble palace, got his monument, got his proof that the farm boy became a king. And none of it saved him, none of it brought him peace, none of it earned him the one thing money can't buy. The warmth of being truly known and truly loved by people who'd still be there if the money disappeared. The gates are closed, the windows dark, the marble cold, and somewhere in those ruins Frank Woolworth's ghost still walks. Still checking the details, still making sure everything's perfect, still searching for something he'll never find because he built the wrong house. He built a palace when he needed a home, built a monument when he needed a refuge, built for eternity when he should have built for the people standing right in front of him, whose time was limited and precious and already running out. Learn from the marble, learn from the gold, learn from the 56 empty rooms. Learn from the cracked fireplace and the burned bedroom and the granddaughter who died poor and the daughter who died desperate. Learn that Frank Woolworth's biggest failure wasn't business or architecture. His biggest failure was believing that if he built something grand enough, it would fill the holes in his soul. It didn't, it can't, it never will, for anyone. Build small, build warm, build with love. That's the lesson Winfield Hall teaches from behind its locked gates. That's the message carved into every inch of its cursed, beautiful, tragic marble halls. And if we're wise, if we're paying attention, if we're humble enough to learn from other people's expensive mistakes, we'll hear it. We'll choose differently. We'll build homes, not monuments. We'll choose warmth over grandeur, people over marble. Love over legacy. That's how you break the curse. That's how you defeat the cold, not by building bigger walls. By opening smaller doors, not by impressing strangers, by cherishing family, not by conquering death through architecture. By living fully with the people you love in whatever small, imperfect space you share. That's the answer Winfield Hall whispers from its ruins. That's the truth Frank Woolworth died without learning. That's the lesson waiting for anyone brave enough to look at 56 marble rooms and see not grandeur, but warning. Not success, but tragedy. Not a palace, but a tomb. The gates are closed. The marble is cracking. The curse remains. But you don't have to repeat it. You can choose warmth. You can build small. You can go home to people who love you and understand that you're already rich in the ways that actually matter. That's the victory Winfield Hall never achieved. That's the peace Frank Woolworth never found. That's the legacy worth leaving. Not marble, not gold, just love, just warmth, just home,